Shucks. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Hammer Museum in the Billy Wilder Theater. I'm Claudia Bester. I'm the Director of Public Programs here, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's program, which is part of our literary series called On Favorite Writers. The series is curated and hosted by renowned novelist Mona Simpson, who's a professor of English here at UCLA, and the series is co-presented by the UCLA Department of English. We're thrilled to have author James Lasdun here tonight. He's a multi-hyphenate writer known not only for his wonderful novels, novellas, and short stories, but also for his poems and his extensive and fascinating nonfiction works, which we'll hear more about tonight. And after the reading and conversation, we'll have a chance to continue the conversation over some light refreshments out in the theater lobby, and James will sign some books. Before we begin, I want to mention some upcoming literary programs you might be interested in. Tomorrow night, Roxane Gay will be here to discuss the new anthology of essays she edited called The Portable Feminist Reader. And on Monday, June 16th, we invite you to join us for our annual Bloomsday celebration of James Joyce's magnum opus, Ulysses. We also have an upcoming talk by jazz artist Jason Moran and a discussion with leading constitutional scholars about the new Supreme Court decisions coming out. Well, the decisions are coming out in the next month. So be sure to check the Hammer calendar for these and other free public programs. Now I'm delighted to introduce our host, Mona Simpson. Mona is the best-selling author of Anywhere But Here, The Lost Father, A Regular Guy, Off Keck Road, My Hollywood, Casebook, and Commitment. Her short stories have appeared in Harper's, The Atlantic, and the Iowa Review, and she's received a Whiting Writers Award, a Guggenheim Fellowship, a Berlin Prize Fellowship, and an award from the American Academy of Arts and Letters. In 2020, she was named Publisher of the Paris Review. Mona meets the most fascinating writers in the world, and we are very grateful to her for bringing some of them here to the Hammer to share with the Los Angeles community. So now please join me in welcoming Mona Simpson, who will introduce James Lasdun.
Hi, thank you for coming on this rainy night. Usually when I introduce a writer whose work I admire, I would probably name all of their books, but James has written too many of them to recount, even though I think he's a year or two, maybe a year younger than I am. He's written 14 books, so I'm going to have to rely on you to go to his website. James was born in London and now lives in the United States. He's been here for about 30-some years, I think. He's published, as Claudia said, in a vast range of medium. He's published novels, a memoir, collections of poetry, and books of short stories. And among them are some of the most distinguished short stories. Those of you who study the short story probably have come across him in your classes. He's also written or co-written the film Sunday, which won Best Feature and Best Screenplay awards at Sundance, and Signs and Wonders, starring Charlotte Rampling and Stellan Skarsgård. With Michael Hoffman, he edited the anthology After Ovid, New Metamorphoses. His essays and reviews have appeared in Harper's, Granta, the London Review of Books, the New York Times, the Guardian, and the New Yorker. His work has been widely translated and won numerous awards, including the inaugural BBC National Short Story Award Prize. He's been a finalist for the T.S. Eliot Prize, the Forward Prize, and the LA Times Book Prize. Critical appraisals of his work are numerous, but I'm just going to read one to you, and it's sort of an important one. Suffice it to say that if a poll were taken among American writers, asking, or just writers in the English language, asking whom they'd choose if they could to love their book and write about it at length, and also asking from whom they'd most dread reading a long, eviscerating response, the overwhelming majority would scribble one name for both, and that would be James Wood. And this is what James Wood has to say about James Lasdun. James Lasdun seems to be one of the secret gardens of English writing. When we read him, we know what language is for. Lasdun is a poet, and of course one would expect on his part an enlarged attention to prose. It is easy to forget how very ordinary most contemporary prose writers are. Lasdun's prose, by contrast, is neither too fancy nor too regular. It is flexible, rich, metaphorical, and lovely. In sentence after sentence, the reader feels Lasdun's words shaping and then freely donating a world to us with great flexible artistry. And James is going to read thrillingly, I think, from 2 new books which are not yet out. Thank you so much. But here's James.
Well, good evening, and thanks for being here, and thank you, Mona, and thank you to the Hammer Museum for continuing to be a beacon of light in this very dark time, and for inviting me here. I'm going to read from a couple of books that are not yet out. One of them I just finished. The other one I haven't finished yet. So, whatever that says. The first is nonfiction, and it's a book about the Murdaugh case. If any of you follow sort of true crime, this was a particularly disturbing one about a personal injury lawyer, involving a personal injury lawyer called Alex Murdaugh, or Alec Murdaugh as he pronounces it, in South Carolina. In a couple of years ago, he was found guilty of murdering his wife and their youngest son, Paul, at their estate in South Carolina in June of 2021. He denied committing the murders, though he did admit that he had embezzled millions from his clients and law firm over the past 15 years. And he claimed that he did that because he had a very bad opioid habit that he needed to spend something like $10 million on. Nobody quite knows what to make of that. Prosecutors believed he killed his wife and son as an attempt to create a kind of distraction from the embezzlements which were about to be exposed. So he was a terrible guy. No question, but by all accounts, he was a loving husband and a doting father. And I had trouble. I covered this. I wrote a couple of articles about it for the New Yorker. But I had trouble believing that he really had blown his 22-year-old son's brains out at close range with a shotgun, and then gunned down his wife of 20 years with a semi-automatic rifle, essentially just to buy himself a little time. And my book is basically an attempt to figure him out. So I'm going to read from a passage about a hearing that I went to on the financial crimes, which was also an opportunity for the victims of those crimes to confront him. And just to set the scene, we're in a courthouse. Alec comes in, all 6'4" of him, looking like he's walking onto a yacht, as he always manages to do somehow, even though he's dressed in his orange prison scrubs with his hands and feet shackled. There's a line I quote in this from the book The Mask of Sanity by Harvey Cleckley, which contains kind of a foundational description of the psychopath as, quote, a subtly constructed reflex machine which can mimic the human personality perfectly. And I'll read from the scene. The lawyers were eloquent, but it was their clients who stole the show, largely because of the radically new emotion they brought to the proceedings. Tony Satterfield began as anyone in his position might. You lied, you cheated, you stole, you betrayed me and my family and everybody else. But his statement quickly turned in a different direction. I want you to know that I forgive you. I will pray for you every day that God gets a hold of your heart. Alec nodded slowly, tilting his head back. He seemed somewhat amazed as the victim of his largest single theft continued in this unexpected vein. My heart is with you, the young hospital worker concluded. My prayers are with you, and I just wish the best for you. I was amazed myself. I knew that Tony Satterfield was a devout Christian and had given part of his settlement money to a charitable foundation set up in his mother's name, but I hadn't foreseen anything like this. As it happened, forgiveness turned out to be the theme of almost all of the victims. Not that they didn't also tell Alex exactly what they thought of him, but the dressings down seemed half-hearted compared with this vehement turning of the other cheek. Pamela Pinckney, whose son Hakeem's terrible injuries and eventual death Alec had remorselessly exploited, told him, "All I want to say to you is, I forgive you from my heart. On this day and forevermore, my prayers and endeavors shall be with you. God bless you." Angel Gary, whose mother's accident settlement Alex had plundered, echoed the sentiment. "God gave me this time just to tell you that I forgive you. I forgive you." I'd never witnessed an act of public forgiveness before. Among other things, I felt rebuked for my own less charitable impulses, which included an initial suspicion that here was yet another kind of vulnerability for Alec to profit from. He certainly seemed to be lapping it up, nodding and murmuring words of gratitude as his victims spoke. And yet there was a curious strength about these speakers, an elated poise that was its own powerful argument for their extraordinary generosity of spirit. They seemed to be releasing themselves in real time from every last trace of pain or rage lingering from Alex's crimes. Jordan Jinks, who'd been close to Alex since they were boys, was more conflicted. Another of the disproportionately high number of African Americans victimized by Alex, Jinks had turned to his supposed friend after being injured in a 2016 car crash and running through his savings on medical bills. Alec took the case, promising to recoup the money. He won a settlement of $150,000 and stole every cent of it. Grey-bearded, glasses perched on his forehead, Jinks smiled briefly at Alex, receiving a rueful smile in return. At one point, having been close to tears throughout, he wept. "I knew I was going to break. Excuse me," he told the judge. "I'm not crying because of what he stole from me. I'm crying for what he did to everybody in these lawsuits, these kids, these people dying." He turned back to Alex. "I didn't want to come up here and bash you, but I gotta ask you, what kind of animal are you?" The murders had barely come up until now, but unlike the other embezzlement victims, Jinks had known Maggie and Paul well, and had evidently been wrestling with the question of whether Alex could really have killed them. It appeared he'd had an insight right there in the courtroom. When all this came out about Pawpaw and Maggie, I couldn't believe it. I didn't believe it. But after sitting here today and hearing some of the devious things that you've did to people, these victims here, it's changed my mind, bro. Once again, I ask you, what kind of animal are you? And yet even this damning re-evaluation, which one would think would curtail any further sympathy, was immediately softened by the strange, enduring tenderness that seems to be an indelible feature in Alex's former friends, even after they've come to believe the very worst of him. "Bo, I gave you my all. The money you stole from me, you could have asked me for it, and I would have gave it to you because that's how I thought about you and your family. You didn't have to steal it from me, man. And I still, if there's any way possible, you set it up for me to be on your visitation list. I want to sit down with you. I want to look you in the eyes and talk to you when I can really talk to you. We've got some intimate things we could talk about." "I would like that," Alex replied. These victim impact statements would have made a fitting end to the day's drama, but there was another act to come. Alex's lawyer, Dick Harpootlian, spoke. "Your Honor, at this time, I would ask that you allow Mr. Murdaugh to address the court." Facing his victims squarely, Alex spoke in short, declarative phrases, pausing between them and conveying in his stance and expressions the emotion appropriate to each one. "I want each of you that spoke to know that I listened to you. I heard you. Your pain and your hurt is palpable. I get it. It's reasonable. And I promise you that it resonates with me. I understand it. I hope that the time will come when you can look back and know that despite the things that I did, that I care about each one of you, because I do. I did terrible things. Each of you placed your trust in me. I was very proud of that, and I'm still today honored by that fact. But I deceived each of you. I did terrible things that, thinking about right now, cause me to be hurt, cause me to be disturbed. It is so important to me that you know how bothered that I am by the things that I did. You could criticize the address for being a little paternalistic, but strictly from the point of view of content, it checked the important boxes for any mea culpa. There was plenty of self-flagellation, plenty of contrition when he did get to the word sorry, plenty of choking up, plenty of detail to illustrate the point that he really did care about these people. The latter was a tricky point to make, considering all the evidence to the contrary, but it seemed to matter greatly to Alex to be seen as a caring person, even now, and he made a concerted effort to convince each of his victims that it was true. JJ, he said, addressing Jordan Jinks, I felt as close to you as anybody. I still do, as anybody I can think of. We grew up together, JJ. We hunted and fished together alone all over the Low Country. I mean, I think we've talked to each other about everything that's important to both of us. And man, I hate the things that I did. Our daddies were the best of friends. I mean it when I say that I care about you. As hypocritical as that seems in light of the things I did, it is so very true. Admitting he'd been hypocritical didn't miraculously dispose of the hypocrisy, but at some level it seemed to work. Jinks wept again as he listened, and Alex repeated the formula with the other victims. But the effectiveness of what he was saying, or even the sincerity of it, was not primarily what interested me. What I was busily trying to gauge was whether there really was something abnormal about him, or whether he was just an unusually extravagant version of the ordinary criminal, the cold opportunist that Cleckley was at such pains to differentiate from his psychopaths and sociopaths. In other words, was this fluorescent figure in his rattling chains self-evidently a subtly constructed reflex machine? Could it be said of him with any certainty that even his facial expressions are without the underlying content they imply? Was it as obvious to me as it had been for Cleckley with his subjects that, for all the appearance of real emotion, reality is not here? It should be easy to detect such things at this proximity, I felt. But I couldn't have said I was picking up anything obviously robotic. As in his police interviews, Alex's command of the sympathy-inducing quality of creatureliness was consummate. He was somehow saturating the human in his seeming struggle to master his emotions, reddening, snuffling, shaking his head, clenching his jaw, falling silent for long, agonized intervals. There was nothing obviously artificial about him, to me, or even obviously empty. And yet there was one feature of the address that was so bizarre that it eventually undermined every one of these seeming indicators of normality. This, strange to say, was its length. Harpootlian had told the judge it would last 5 or 10 minutes, and after about 15 minutes, Alec did bring his apology to the victims to an end. But it turned out he was far from ready to withdraw into the humble silence of the repentant sinner awaiting judgment. Now I want to talk to a few different people, he announced. I want to start with Buster, that's his older son who was away on the night of the murders. Well, fair enough, Buster had certainly had his life upended by his father, so perhaps a public apology was reasonable, even though Buster wasn't actually present. In itself, the apology was again unremarkable, but it dragged on, and after another 10 minutes, you could feel the courtroom growing restless. Oblivious, Alec continued. Next, I'd like to speak to my mom, my brothers, my sister, my nieces, and my nephews, who I love dearly, my aunts and uncles, cousins, the rest of my family. An odd note of pride crept into his tone here, as if he were trying to add the role of defender of his family's honor to that of abject penitent. I am so sorry that I destroyed my family's reputation with these terrible things that I've done. I'm so sorry that my actions that I am pleading guilty to here today somehow made people on social media and in the media think that it's okay to falsely attack two of the best men that I've ever known, and that's my father and my grandfather. On it went. Remorse, pride, protestations of love, the superlatives heaped on his nearest and dearest, which had the effect of suggesting that he, too, would have been one of these paragons had he not been too proud to get help with his opioid addiction. The restlessness in the courtroom turned to an increasingly bridling impatience. One of the prosecuting attorneys began conspicuously thumbing her phone. It was beyond unseemly for the victims to be subjected to this torrent of words that had nothing at all to do with them, and you could practically hear people wondering why the judge was allowing it. A half hour passed, 40 minutes. Moving on finally from the family and in-laws, Alex started on his law partners. Every one of you is not only one of the best lawyers that I've ever been around, but the best people that I've ever been around. Such good, such compassionate, such smart, such giving, and such decent people. And I again am so sorry that I went to such great lengths to hide my addiction and to hide my criminal acts from each of you. From there, he began using his admission of guilt in the embezzlements to highlight his stance of innocence in the murders, all under cover of further contrition. I now apologize to every single person who cares about Maggie and about Paul, because I know that the things that I did, that I'm pleading guilty to here today, allowed the Attorney General's office to focus on me and not to pursue the person or the people who hurt and killed Maggie and Paw. Even now, he wasn't done. Admonitions to fellow addicts followed, a kind of Narcotics Anonymous testimonial, complete with shout-outs. A special thank you to the people at Evolve Recovery and Rehabilitation Center, and a finale that suggested he'd been transported in his own mind from a sentencing hearing at the Beaufort Court of General Sessions to a stage at the Oscar ceremonies. Lastly, I want to thank the men and women who have sent me letters, emails, and given messages to my attorneys with genuine messages of support. They mean more to me than you could possibly know. He had spoken for the better part of an hour. It occurred to me, not for the first time, that this apparent lack of even a basic sense of proportionality might, in his case, be the telltale indicator of a serious pathological condition. He could turn on emotion like a spigot, but he had no idea when to turn it off, and he appeared to operate in the blind hope that the more he spewed it out, the more human he would seem. In the recess that followed, I joined the defense attorneys and the TV producer Brooke Brunson at a nearby Starbucks. Brunson remarked that we had just had a textbook lesson on sociopathy. The attorneys, who seemed as stunned as everybody else, did not disagree. The judge will cut his ass a new one, Harpootlian said. I asked how it was possible that someone as savvy about courtroom maneuvering as Alex supposedly was wouldn't know better than to yammer on like that. He can't help himself, Harpootlian replied. So I'll leave it there. Thank you. And now for some fiction. This is from a novel in progress. It may sound more like nonfiction, and it does have a sort of memoirish element with a narrator who's basically me, but it is a novel. It's fiction. I mean, it'll be a novel if I ever finish it, which I will. It's set mostly in the 1970s London that I grew up in. My father was an architect who designed mostly public buildings, and the world he moved in was mostly cultural and political establishment types. At the same time as all that work and socializing was going on, the IRA London bombing campaign was underway and things were being blown up all over the place, which is part of the novel, although not really part of this excerpt. I'm going to read from an excerpt that was published in the Paris Review under the title Helen. She was a friend of my family, the Carlins, as I have chosen to call them. She and my father met in the 50s through the editor of the architecture magazine where she began her career. My father had taken her out a few times. They were never lovers, but there had been some tenderness between them, enough that years later, when she took to phoning our house in the middle of the night, my father would drag himself out of bed, and I would hear the low monosyllables of someone listening to another's woes, patiently, if without great interest, until I fell back to sleep. My mother, absolutely unthreatened by this sallow, angular woman, with her horn-rimmed glasses and staring eyes, who by then looked unwell much of the time, would say, after these nocturnal disturbances, "Poor Helen, we ought to do something for her." Yes, my father would agree warily, and they would invite her to dinner in London or to Salesy for the weekend. In fact, they had already done something for Helen in at least one significant way. They had introduced her to their friends Renata and Otto Schenker, proprietors of the Whitethorn Press, who took her on as a proofreader and an editor after she lost her job at the architecture magazine. Occasionally, Helen would take me and my sister to a pantomime. I found her a forbidding figure, unsnapping her hard little handbag for cigarettes every few minutes and arguing viciously with the bus conductors and other officials we encountered. Later in life, I began to find her more interesting. She came down to Salesy one weekend in the summer of 1975. My mother had invited some neighbors to join us for Sunday lunch. It was a hot July day. Helen had been out on the lawn in a deck chair with the papers since 11, sipping her dry vermouth and smoking. She broke off with her usual irritable air when the guests arrived. At lunch, my mother placed Edward Leto, the judge who owned a weekend home nearby, on one side of Helen. On the other, my mother placed a young American, Ralph Pomeroy, who had recently inherited a dilapidated old manor house in the area and was trying his hand at English country life. Helen seemed fascinated by his appearance and at the same time intent on picking a quarrel with him. At one point I heard her snap, "What a ghastly idea," at a comment he'd made about turning his house into a commune. "Why is that ghastly?" Ralph asked, smiling. "Oh, dear God, where should I begin?" "I mean, did you ever live in an intentional community?" "A what?" "Well, on a commune." "You're not serious." "I've lived on several myself. I find them to be very positive places, mostly." Helen looked him up and down, scrutinizing the unruly hair and excitable tawny eyes, the collarless linen shirt billowing over his robust torso, the gold-embroidered waistcoat, as if for implications she might have missed. "Well, perhaps you're more naive than you realize." "Oh, I know I'm naive. Even so, I'd like to give it a try. I think human beings are inherently drawn to small communities where they have a stake in everything that goes on and everyone shares the Rubbish," Helen interrupted. "You're talking about hobbits, not human beings." Ralph laughed. "Well, I am a kind of hobbit myself at heart, but I think it's true. We feel alienated and isolated in these vast impersonal societies we've created. We hanker for something more like a tribe, where we can help each other along instead of this dog-eat-dog. Oh, for heaven's sake," Helen interrupted, splashing some wine into her glass. By now, their conversation had attracted other people's attention. There was an MP there, Peter Dacey, a wartime friend of my father's, who'd been a junior minister in Harold Wilson's first government. "This is the Schumacher line," he said, looking at Ralph over his wire-rimmed glasses. "Small is beautiful." Ralph looked surprised. "You've read that?" Daisy nodded. I think he's onto something, especially with his idea of sustainable development. That makes good sense to me. Where he loses me is this obsession with pulling everything down to the village scale. There are things a large, complex state can do that are absolutely unique. Like building nuclear weapons, Ralph said. Daisy smiled. Fair point, but I mean positive things. Hospitals, universities, large-scale agriculture. I'm not sure about large-scale agriculture, Ralph cut in, but he was interrupted by my father, whose ears had pricked up at the mention of Schumacher, a particular bête noire of his at that time. Villages won't give you the pyramids, he growled, and tribes won't give you Chartres. You might get a good barn if you're lucky, but that's about it. Joseph's right, Ralph, the judge said, joining the discussion. There'd be no culture worth speaking of if we all lived in little tribal groups. Can you imagine if the salesy village council tried to mount a production of Rigoletto? He allowed himself a smile before unexpectedly coming to Ralph's defense. All the same, I do think these alternative lifestyles offer a way of opting out of the status quo that doesn't involve blowing everything to smithereens. To that extent, I'm on Ralph's side. Helen sat in silence while the men had their views. She was oddly deferential towards males of established authority, tending to fix her eyes on them when she spoke, even if she was responding to something said by a woman. In fact, with few exceptions, she seemed to dislike women. The same frantic look she had when she was being disagreed with would appear in her eyes whenever another woman spoke at length, as if she were being suffocated. My mother leaned forward. Well, I'm on Helen's side. Sorry, I just think I couldn't put up with the lack of privacy. Helen flashed an irritated look that suggested she especially did not like to be agreed with by my mother. Though before she could say anything, the judge's wife, Elizabeth, began speaking. She was a powerful-looking woman, tall and statuesque, with shiny black eyes that had something at once inquisitive and remote about them. We actually had a sort of commune here once, she said, in one of the old farm cottages on the heath. It was filthy, by all accounts, and rife with drugs. A baby almost died, and the district nurse was so appalled by the conditions, she got the police to go in. She told me the kitchen had to be seen to be believed. The children were undernourished, and according to one of the neighbors, they used to be given LSD and sent out to steal milk from people's doorsteps in the village. They had a rule that biological parents weren't allowed to discipline their own children. But then they had another rule that if any members of the opposite sex didn't get on, they had to sleep together. So in fact, nobody knew who half the biological fathers even were. Helen had begun to look agitated. Yes, but that's all utterly beside the point, she burst out. The problem has nothing to do with sex or drugs or the lack of privacy or being on a small scale. You're all simply imposing your own trifling little phobias and obsessions on the subject. Whether you're a Puritan like Elizabeth, or you can't bear the thought that other people might smell your shit like Vivian, or you think no one's going to commission a great big important building anymore. But that's absolute nonsense, all of it. The problem with communes has nothing to do with any of that. I can assure you, nothing whatsoever. Nothing. There was a silence. It was Ralph who broke it, turning to her with the implausible timidity of large men trying to exhibit a deferential attitude. What is the problem, then? She glared at him. They're a lie. That's the problem, she replied, her voice high and trembling. They tell us lies about ourselves, and then what happens? Charles Manson is what happens. But he's just the most banal example. Even without him, you'd all be skinning one another alive. What lies? Ralph persisted mildly. I'm curious to hear. What are the lies they tell us about ourselves? She gave a toss of her head as if to say, must I really spell it out? And yet she wouldn't or couldn't spell it out. Instead, she rummaged in her handbag for a cigarette, lit it, inhaled ferociously, and brought the base of her thumb to her forehead as though she'd been smitten by a sudden headache. Ralph continued looking at her expectantly, but she said nothing. The effect was to compound the hostility of her behavior with the suggestion that she didn't actually have anything to say and had just been acting out of some odd compulsion to alienate herself from everyone present. Eventually, my mother spoke. Elizabeth, another piece of salmon? I got in touch with Helen's old boss at the Whitethorn Press, Renata Schenker, when I went to London after my mother died in 2016. She invited me for a drink at her office in Fulham, which was also her home. She was in poor health, swollen up, and walking with a great rubber-hoofed metal stick. "You came to see me about a job here once, didn't you?" she said, lowering herself carefully into an armchair. "I think I sat on this very sofa." I patted the threadbare green upholstery beside me. "I seem to remember you had somewhat exalted views about publishing. I think you thought it would all be high-flown talk about literature. I was looking for an office boy." "I'd have been happy as that," I said. "I don't think so." "Well, and are you writing another book?" "Sort of," I said. "I'm trying to write about the world I grew up in, my parents' world, I suppose, London in the 70s. She nodded politely. "I've tried before several times and given up, but somehow the subject keeps coming back. It's very vivid to me. There was a very particular human atmosphere. I'm not sure I can put my finger on it. Some sort of balance between starchiness and flexibility, or cautious skepticism and an openness to experimentation. Possibly it had to do with that generation coming of age during the war and then attaining positions of power and influence in the wake of the 60s revolutions. They took themselves seriously in a way people aren't allowed to anymore, but at the same time I broke off, starting to feel self-conscious. Anyway, at this point I'm just trying to gather details about some of the personalities and stories I might want to include." A look of guarded interest flickered in Renata's eyes. "I've been trying to remember the parties my parents gave in London every autumn," I said. "There's one in particular I'm thinking of trying to recreate. You were there with Otto, of course." "Well, we were at all of them. This would have been in 1975. I found the guest list in my mother's papers. All the usual architects and gallery people were on it, dignitaries from the Arts Council, a few more bohemian types." "I'm picturing the scene," Renata said. "All those earnest men with their striped shirts and greying sideburns, spouting opinions at high volume. I have to say, it seems a bit old hat in this day and age, doesn't it? It's their long-suffering wives people want to hear about nowadays, or better still, their cleaning ladies." "Helen Needham was there," I said. "Your Helen." "Helen? Gosh. I haven't heard her name in a while. Well, she was always there too. I think she brought someone with her that time, some man friend of hers." "A man friend? That doesn't sound like Helen. Oh, wait a minute. Was that the year she wasn't invited? I think it was." I was puzzled. I mean, she came, so... Yes, she was invited in the end, but not initially. She was terribly upset. She saw our invitation, mine and Otto's, up on the mantelpiece there, and I suppose she was expecting hers to arrive any time, but it didn't. Your parents must have run out of patience with her. I know they found her difficult. She was difficult. Anyway, we'd hear her on the office phone talking to acquaintances and trying to worm out of them whether they'd been invited or not. And when she found out they had been, she'd give a grim laugh and say, "Well, I haven't. I've obviously been dropped. The Carlins have finally had enough of me," and she'd try to make light of it. But she was clearly hurt. Well, I know she was upset. I read about it in her journal. In the end, Otto went to visit your father on some pretext and mentioned how upset she was, and of course your father had his secretary send her an invitation right away. I hadn't heard this story, but more surprising to me was the news that Helen kept a journal. I'd have thought she would have considered such a thing contemptibly self-indulgent. "I didn't know she kept a journal," I said, trying not to sound too interested. "Well, really just a set of engagement diaries, but often with comments added after the events she attended. There was one open on her desk the day we broke into her flat. You've heard about that episode, I suppose. This was when the bottles... Yes, hundreds of empty bottles piled everywhere, on the shelves, under the sofa, in the bathroom, everywhere. I didn't realize you were the ones who found her." "Oh, yes. She hadn't come to work for several days and wasn't answering her phone. Otto called the police and they sent us there with a policewoman and a locksmith. The policewoman went into the bedroom and found Helen on the bed. She'd been dead for some time, apparently. Otto went in to confirm it was her, but I didn't want to see. I noticed the diary while they were in there. Her only relative was a half-brother in Canada. I had to let him into the flat when he arrived, and he asked if there was anything I'd like as a memento, and I said I'd like her diaries. I promised if I ever published them, he'd get the royalties. And I did think of trying to excerpt a book from them, but they obviously weren't written for publication. Too private? I asked. Too fragmentary and impressionistic, and I'm afraid rather mean-spirited. Disappointingly so, in my view. She didn't make much of an effort to rise above herself. I didn't share Renata's views on the importance of rising above oneself. Would you let me read them? I asked. She gave me a reproachful look. I suppose I should have seen that coming. I said nothing. How does Helen fit into this project of yours? She asked a little peevishly. She was hardly a member of the cultural establishment, was she? And she wasn't a bohemian either, far from it. I prevaricated. Nobody trusts a writer, but they will generally talk themselves into cooperating if you let them. The diaries were in a cabinet by the bay window. There were a lot of them, 28 to be precise, blue cloth-bound volumes with the year embossed in silver on each spine. The entries below start directly after the weekend of that lunch at my parents' house in Salesy. It was disconcerting to see my family through Helen's unsparing eyes, and her version of her relationship with my father, while not totally incompatible with his own, came as a surprise. I was struck, too, by her use of the word ghastly, which appears to have been her favorite adjective, even to the point of evident self-parody. I haven't heard it much since I moved to the States. Awful or terrible are the words an American would probably use in its place, but these don't begin to convey the state of incandescent, almost spiritual horror that ghastly spreads backward over the person using it. Ghastly weekend at the Carlins, the entry began. Ghastly people to lunch, including that ghastly judge of theirs and his even ghastlier blue-stocking wife, along with a ghastly young American who wants us all to live on his commune. And of course, ghastliest of all, toads hopping out. And of course, ghastliest of all, myself, toads hopping out of my mouth whenever I open it. There is something wrong with me. I don't seem to work properly. I am a defective machine that ought to have been returned to its manufacturer promptly upon delivery. Or if I am not, in fact, a broken version of myself, then what role in society could my peculiar traits possibly have been evolved to play? Is there some tribal need for the figure who must always disagree, excoriate, thrust the fact of people's essential folly and banality in their faces, even when they are not being especially foolish or banal? Because I seem designed to play it to the exclusion of anything else. I'll leave it at that. Thank you. I think we're going to talk.
Very exciting. You mentioned that before this, you mentioned that we had a little talk with the students, and it came up. Someone asked whether the journal in this piece was actually existed, since the narrator is to some extent based on you, and you said that the journals were absolutely made up.
Yeah, completely made up. Yeah.
How much of the journals do you know what's in them?
I mean, there were no journals, so.
But I mean, in the fictional world you've created, how far have you gone into her journals?
I mean, they go on for a long time. They're a big part of the.
Oh, cool.
Of that part of the book, and I mean, I wanted to really get inside her, and it just seemed she had a very particular, the way that she had evolved as a character. She had a very particular way of talking. I mean, certain words that she favored and a very distinct kind of attitude. And I felt I wanted to hear it kind of in an unbridled way. And so I started writing a journal in her voice. And it's also a part of the story that is quite sort of dense with the plot, which involves actually the IRA at that point. So it fulfilled both of those things.
One thing that's sort of fascinating about her too is you've sort of created this. You've got the Jewish character as the narrator, but instead of you noticing things about your parents' world, you have someone else doing it, which is kind of a neat trick.
Oh, well, yeah, thanks. I mean, it did occur to me that was something I could, you could do,
Yeah.
which I hadn't particularly. I had, when I sort of was thinking about writing this, I had sort of assumed it would be a narrator kind of based on me opining about
Right.
everything. And actually, I came to realize that it's much more interesting if
It's much more fun to have someone else do it.
Yeah.
And you're kind of the innocent.
Right.
bumbling.
Occasionally you chip in, but
Yeah.
I mean, usually getting it wrong. But I mean, I think that, and that actually became a sort of big piece of the novel is you keep glimpsing situations and people from unexpected vantage points, unexpected points of view.
And it's probably very useful to have somebody who's not your narrator, not a part of that world, see that class.
Absolutely, because otherwise it just becomes a kind of echo chamber,
Yeah.
and it also begins to sound like a novel that was written in 1975 rather than being about 1975 from a very different point of
How far are you with it now?
I think I'm about 3/4 of the way through it.
And how do you work, James? Do you sort of perfect a section and then you're done with it, or do you write a draft of the whole thing and then do a lot more? What is your method?
I always try to go as far as I possibly can, but that's usually not very far. And
that's not very far because
I get to a point where if it isn't, it feels like an unsound
right.
foundation,
right.
And things start to wobble. And I feel like I have to go back. There's something not right about it, and so
keep going back.
Keep going back until it feels right. It doesn't always like that, but that's mostly how it is. I would like to be more spontaneous and just
Wouldn't
write the
we
whole
all?
thing.
But you're very productive despite this quality of.
It doesn't seem so to me. But I mean. They're all very short. I've written a lot of books, but they're very short.
They're not all very short, but some are short.
They're a lot shorter than yours.
Yes, well, mine are getting shorter. But so it's interesting. It's interesting that that there's elements of sort of truth in this novel. Especially since you've been doing all this nonfiction. How do you feel about changing things? I mean, what are the ethical? I think we're all thinking about that these days. Now that so many people publish memoirs and.
I think, I don't think there are any ethics in novel writing, really.
I don't really either.
I
Convenient for us to think so.
I do think that, nonfiction, that it's a very ethical, you have to, of course. I think in a novel, it's a place of absolute freedom of the imagination to go where it's drawn and do what it wants to do. That isn't to say that you don't have to overcome all kinds of kind of personal not taboos, but little obstacles and resistances when it comes to basing characters on people and I'm not advocating malicious sort of portrayal of people who can obviously see themselves, and I'm not interested in doing that. But I mean, would I be writing this the same way if my parents were still alive? Perhaps not. I don't know.
Yeah.
Maybe it had to wait until they weren't.
No, that's an interesting thing. I think that's true.
Yeah.
I remember Alice Munro once said that sort of in the first half of her life, she was writing a lot about her romantic relationships. And then the real heat of her emotional life in the second half of her life was her children, but you can't really write about them because you want to have supper with them on Sunday.
I think I suppose writing about your children. I mean, that might be it.
That might be
I
it.
might even have a line there.
Well, and they are, of course, going to read it.
Yeah.
So, now, what about Murdaugh? It's so fascinating that you've sort of taken it as that you've become fascinated and deeply understanding him.
I mean, I don't know if I understand him.
Do you feel like you must understand him a lot more than you did when you started? Or do you?
I know a bit more about him. I have the context. I put him in I look at him from various kind of angles. I mean, I listen to what other people have said about him.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I talk to as many people as would talk to me, which wasn't that many, but it was a certain number. I talked to his lawyers. I never talked to him, but I was sitting very close to him.
Do you think it would have changed things if you'd talked to him?
It would be good copy. I don't think it would. No, because I mean, he's a big talker, right? So if he had
Really?
agreed
Just
to
from
talk
the
to me,
section?
I think he would have just deluged me with all that stuff.
So you don't think he could have seduced you in any way?
No, I mean, because I really did have resistance to the thought that he was guilty. I mean, for all kinds of reasons.
Well, tell us some of the reasons.
Well, I mean, there were alternate theories of the murders. I mean, they didn't hold up mostly, but I actually come up in the book. I'm not going to sort of lay it out now, but I do come up with an alternate theory that fits in, that works with everything that happened, everything we know, and is plausible in the sense that it sort of follows some of the things that his habits of mind might plausibly do. It's not that I think he did it that it happened that way, and that way being a way in which he is not the actual killer. I think he probably did kill them in the end, but and I also looked at him through the lens of like criminology and criminal psychology, and a number of other things. So it's not that I feel like I've cracked the code or I know him, but I do feel put it this way, I feel that if I understand him in the same way that I feel I understand a fictional character that I create. I think I know, I have a version of what I think makes him tick and how his mind works. I think I was able to extrapolate some kind of picture of that from the facts, strictly from the facts, and they are part of the book. And I, whether it's absolutely, I mean, it can only be conjectural. But I feel I got a little bit of an understanding of a very, very strange character.
For sure.
But a kind of oddly represented. I mean, in some way. I mean, he's one of these golden con men who we all just seem to fall for.
So interesting, though. Like in a way, your interest in the sort of criminal mind started with the memoir, but really then with the piece about. For many of you may know that James wrote a piece about his own personal dentist, who he'd seen for how many years had he been?
Oh, he was our kid's dentist. He was our family dentist
for like 20 years.
10 years.
Like 10 years.
Yeah.
He was accused of murdering his lover's husband, and you followed him and did a piece on that, and that, I mean, did you, in the process of doing these pieces, have you become interested in criminology? Have you done research? Are you? Because it seems like a likely thing in a way for a fiction writer to.
I mean, I'm only interested in a somewhat sort of amateurish way, and I didn't look into it then because I thought my dentist was innocent. He was acquitted, so I wasn't the only person who thought he was.
But
I happen to think he was guilty now.
Now you've changed your mind.
Sort of a long time afterwards, I kind of changed my mind. So the literature of criminal psychology might be opposite now, but although I mean he was very weird, and he did things that a normal person would not do. But I mean, I'm not obsessed with criminal psychology. I thought in this instance, everyone was using the word, oh well, of course he killed him. He's a sociopath, And, well, what does that mean?
Yeah.
And people have a little kind of two-line answer if they have any kind of answer at all. But I did want to look a little more deeply into it. And I read this kind of foundational text, which I quoted from, by Harvey Cleckley, The Mask of Sanity. And it's a fascinating book. It's very dated. It's full of awful kind of antiquated ideas about people and gender and everything like that. But it is what's good about it is it's a very detailed set of case studies. He was a working psychiatrist in a psychiatric hospital, and he'd be sent these individuals who didn't sort of fit the normal profile of an ordinary criminal or a cold opportunist, as he called them. But they weren't kind of crazy either. They were functional. And the case studies are really interesting in relation to the Murdaugh story, because almost every one of the people that he talks about had some very distinct characteristic in common with Murdaugh. Almost all of them were embezzling or doing forgery of one kind or another. That seemed to be the real common thread. Interestingly, he didn't think psychopaths, as in his definition, were violent. In popular culture, that's come to mean like the most violent.
Yeah.
But in fact, he characterized them as sort of lacking a kind of sense of purpose and being too drawn towards. He thought what motivated them was a kind of craving for disaster. And
So it was really the disaster they were after, or because forgery and embezzlement would also lead you to think it was money.
But the money was only it was their kind of pretext for
So
doing
they
it.
wanted to get
But their
caught, in a
embezzlement
way.
schemes, like his, were so florid, so over the top, so ridiculous. Like one of them was renting out the house of one of his neighbors, and only when she was out shopping, he would go and cut deals with people to rent her house. And of course, he was going to get caught. And because when she came back from the shops, I mean that's a very extreme example, but I mean they were all, but Murdaugh's schemes, which he did not get caught at for years, but they were absolutely ridiculous, and it was only because he lived in this strange little enclosed world of the South Carolina Low Country that nobody called him on any of this stuff. I mean, it was.
Why
should
were
have
his
been
victims? I mean, first of all, like it's interesting too that he was a personal injury lawyer because, of course, that's considered kind of the creepiest.
Yeah, but it's the only industry down there that everybody is suing each other.
Oh my God!
And and everyone's getting in accidents.
Why are his victims so forgiving of him?
That was an extraordinary. I mean, I don't know whether that's because it's also a very Christian, religious culture, but I think what I got from that in the end, I mean, these were all very vulnerable people who had either they'd had accidents or their nearest and dearest had accidents. They'd gone to him, they had trusted him. He was there. They all regarded him as their knight in shining armor for years, and he would win these big settlements for them, and he managed to make them think that the settlements were all safely kind of
invested somewhere.
Invested.
Oh,
sometimes he would give them some of it, or have a certain amount of it dispersed. But he would tell them it was all being looked after.
So it was kind of like a Madoff scheme.
It was until he started stealing entire settlements, like that first guy.
I know. I mean, how did he hope to get away with that?
Yeah, well, that's
the disaster
what part. Because I think. I don't think it was like a conscious I need disaster, but I do think there was an element of that explains his embezzling. It doesn't explain the murders. It really doesn't, because as Harvey Cleckley said, these people are not. It doesn't usually.
Somehow that motive too of kind of creating a big fracas to distract people from the embezzlement. I mean, maybe it's the truth, but it doesn't. It seems far-fetched when you're actually standing in front of your wife and child and killing them.
And it was very close range. And no, I mean, that crime, assuming he committed it, and I'm afraid I think he did.
Are you conflicted still about it, or you mostly think he did?
I mostly think he did. I mean, I'm probably the last person who has any doubts, but I mean, and part of those doubts are just to do with the kind of horror of it. But that the murders are more covered by the literature on this term I had never heard before the trial, which came out when the prosecutor sort of very dramatically pointed at him and thundered, "Are you a family annihilator?" And this is a term, family annihilator. It's a profession, and or it's a kind of, it's a thing, it's a phenomenon. And there's a certain, not very much, but there is a certain amount of literature on it. And he does.
What is the literature on? And family annihilator, that means it has to be more than killing your spouse. It has to be
it's your wife, your spouse. It's mostly, there actually are women who've killed men and their children too. But yeah, your spouse and one or more of your children, and often your pets as well.
Oh.
And I mean, it's gruesome and ghastly.
Did
and horrible.
He kill pets as well?
No, he didn't. No.
He limited himself.
But usually there
was some restraint.
We're in very
In fact,
dark
there were dogs involved, weren't there? I seem to
yeah, but
remember that from the piece.
not as victims of the crime.
No, but then they kind of implicated him in some way.
Absolutely, yeah.
He should have killed the dogs.
He should have killed the dog. Yeah. The dogs play a very interesting part in the story. These hunting dogs they kept at their estate. It's a very strange story. A very there are many moving parts to it. It's not just his wife and his son who were killed. There are 3 other bodies in the story. There's the former housekeeper. There's a young guy who was found. I mean, she died after falling on the stairs at their house. There was a young guy who was found dead on the road nearby, who the family knew. And there was a young woman killed by his son, the son who he killed, killed by the son by accident in a boat crash. So there's a lot of.
I remember reading that.
Yeah.
Do you think you might be tempted by another nonfiction crime?
I mean, it wasn't.
Not especially.
I wasn't looking to do a crime story particularly. It's true that after I wrote my memoir about, which came out of an experience of being stalked, and after that, I got interested in. It's more that I started to get bored with stuff that was not about terrible things. That didn't have a body count of a certain number. I just didn't see the point of it. And yeah.
So no more. It's beginning to hurt in your life.
I mean, I would like to go back to that because it's a dark place to be.
I can imagine, but it's still. You still feel? Do you feel you could be attracted to that again?
It would depend. I'm not. I'm not. I don't follow. I'm not like a true crime.
You're not looking.
Addict.
You're not looking for
I'm
the
not
next
looking
case.
for it, but I do find it interesting.
Yeah, it is.
And
really
some
interesting.
of them, and some of the crimes are. I mean, like this one is, it's an interesting story for all kinds of reasons, but it's also, well, I guess one of the reasons is, I mean, it opened up a whole world. I mean, to me,
Yeah.
I knew nothing about this world of sort of moneyed landowners of the Deep South and their hunting and their fishing and their
and the way they talk,
litigation and they're amazing, the way they talk, which I've really tried to get as much of the sort of actual words that they use into the book as I possibly can. My publishers at one point, his prison phone calls to his family were all recorded, and the press, a local newspaper managed to get a freedom of information, get them, which is practically unheard of. And there's pages and pages of this, and I transcribed them all.
and he's talking to his family.
He's talking to his surviving son. He's talking to his 2 brothers, to their wives, and to his son's girlfriend.
There's no privacy protection thing for that?
I mean, you're told that your jail calls are recorded, and maybe used. So you know that someone's recording them and maybe listening, but
I thought they listened in to see that if you were smuggling in
yeah,
a
that
knife
kind of thing.
in
But
the
you
cake.
don't think that they're going to be sort of published
No,
or
that's interesting.
released, but they were.
And
And they are, I mean, they're fascinating because that's where you really get to the sort of novelistic side of the family, their way of talking to each other, their way of being with each other, their vernacular. And I wanted to use everything. And I had like a 50-page chunk in the middle of the book, which was just the transcriptions of I mean, it was so extraordinary because they were all telling each other, "I love you, I love you, I love you so much, Alec," and
they're all
I love you
telling
too,
him.
brother.
Everybody loves him.
But this
Everybody's forgiving him.
this was before he had been indicted for murder. But everybody knew that he was a suspect at that point. But they never really they never touched on the murders. It was all and they knew he had embezzled millions from his clients. But I love you so much, and I just thought this was sort of, I mean.
That's fascinating.
Yeah. Anyway, I had to cut it down, but it's still quite a lot of it. But
Well, I could go on forever. This is so interesting, but I know the audience has questions, so I'll turn it over to you.
So your memoir has the IRA in it and the London.
Get you the mic.
I mean, the novel rather. Does that? Oh, sure. I'm wondering if your present interest in having body counts in your books is why you merged your fictional memoir with IRA bombings.
it may be. It may be. I mean, it's also. I mean, that really was. I mean, I was in my teens during the IRA's what they called the mainland campaign, where they were blowing up a lot of stuff, and at one point, I was woken by a bomb that went off not far from our house, and it had been set. It was a car bomb. It was underneath the car of an MP, but he wasn't in it at the time, and it killed a passerby whose dog had seen something under the car and had gone to do something, and the car blew up, killed him and the dog, and he was a friend of my parents. And so it was it made an impact. It was like, I was a kind of a dopey teenager, and it was like suddenly, it was like waking up into the reality of the world in some way. I mean, I'm slightly over dramatizing it, but I never forgot that. And I've always sort of wanted to sort of look at it and think about it and write about it.
Another question. There's one.
Oh, hi. I was just wondering what authors or people in your life inform your work and inspire you.
Oh wow! I mean, I so many. I'll tell you who I was reading a lot while I was writing the book about the Murdaugh case was Janet Malcolm.
She's so good.
Isn't she? I mean, I sort of knew she was good before, but I'd never really read her in depth.
She's amazing.
Yeah. I mean, what can one say? I mean, yeah. So I had those books. I had like almost all of her books.
No, she's incredible.
What I like about her, I mean, is the sort of the really kind of ferocious, extreme nature of the subject matter and the very cool style. What do you?
I like her because she's not sentimental at all about the role of the journalist. You know, she's always very well aware of what the journalist is, how the journalist is changing the story for the subject.
Yeah.
And how the subjects kind of let the journalist in, even if the journalist is really not to their best interest.
Yeah.
No, she's fantastic. I love her. In fact, there should be a Library of America edition of Janet Malcolm.
I'm sure there will be.
No, they don't want to.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Tell.
We should all be campaigning for
Bizarre.
that. I know. Isn't that crazy?
It's
very
terrible. Very crazy, yeah.
No, she's great.
Well, there is one of her books that, I mean, I
Journalist
love
and
them
the
all.
Murderer.
Well, that's a great book, and I actually quote from that in this book. But There's another book she wrote about a trial, which is a little bit of a cautionary book as well as a model for me. It's called Iphigenia in Queens, and it's about this trial of a woman who was accused of and found guilty of having her estranged husband killed by a hitman. I think that's basically it. And for some reason, Janet Malcolm decided this woman had been wrongly accused and was innocent. She was sure she was innocent. And I know nothing about the case except what I've read by Janet Malcolm, and it seems to me absolutely self-evident that she's guilty. I mean,
well, she's such a fabulous writer. But like, for example, if you read her stuff on Sylvia Plath, it's quite clear that she hated Sylvia Plath and is completely won over by the Hugheses. So she's completely on Ted Hughes' side. He seduced her completely.
Right. Yeah. She's sort of
She's not. She's
partisan.
She's a person. You know. And you get her.
Yeah.
You get her juice. But I know there's more questions. I can't. We have to wait till the microphones get to the interlocutors.
It's just a comment. I don't read books. I listen to podcasts at 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. I read articles and I'm an avid reader. But my partner here, she's always reading a book. But if anything could get me to read books, it was the gripping and kind of, immediacy, and it was almost like a Peter Lorre kind of, dialogue. It was very gripping. I really enjoyed your readings. So
That's
great.
great.
Very nice of you to say. Thank you.
And I'm sure, by the way, it'll be a book on Audible.
Yeah. Yes.
You might enjoy listening to books. I listen to books while I Peloton. It can be great.
Hi, thank you. I really enjoyed your readings. I was wondering if you could talk more about writing, like fictionalizing things from your life, and in the process of writing that book, how you kind of decide what to make up, and just more of the process of taking your real lived experience and fictionalizing it.
Well, it's a good question. I mean, I in this particular novel, I don't usually do a lot of research, and I didn't do a lot of research for this. Or I mean, I did a certain amount, but I read it. I mean, I did end up reading a lot of sort of biographies of the people who were around at that time, either in or adjacent to the circle that my parents moved in, and. In a lot of these biographies didn't interest me that much, but every now and then there would be just a really fascinating episode. And I would think, God, this is wasted on this boring biography. Let me see what I can do with it.
Give us an example. I like that.
Well, there's things that I'm not sure if I can quite do this, but I mean, there's... a lot of them are just like rote biographies of politicians, and because my father was doing doing work that was paid for by the government, institutional buildings. He did sort of mix with politicians, and so I go back to read some of their biographies, and they're there'll be little funny incidents that. Sort of the kinds of scenes that you don't often see in contemporary novels. Like these people were going to banquets with the Queen or something like that. Or they were at meetings at Downing Street where somebody spills ink all down Nixon's shirt or something,
it'd be great to have some of that.
It's just a little bit of that that just amuses me or else feels kind of germane in some way to the characters. I might not replicate the scene itself, but it takes you to places that you you wouldn't have got by yourself unless you were Dickens or something. I mean, I wouldn't have got to by myself, and then you kind of make it your own in some way, and because I'm already kind of writing about that world somewhat from the inside, it seems to fit. So I felt able to kind of merge the real or the remembered and the imagined or purloined or whatever you want to call it. Quite. It seems to work naturally in this particular book. I don't know that it always would, and I'm not generally drawn to books that are kind of half real, half not. But that's the way it is.
I think we have time for one more question. Oh, I do feel for you.
Hi. So, with something like the Murdaugh case, where you have so much material, where it kind of feels like if you were just to give the facts exactly, like the full transcript of all these phone calls, it would be fascinating by itself. And I'm sure it was maybe even tempting to put that whole speech, his hour-long speech in there. How do you figure out where to come in and where to cut something that's so rich in the rawness and add your own voice to it?
I mean, that was something I had to sort of figure out in the process of writing it, because you do. I mean, I started off by putting absolutely everything. Like I would put in entire legal depositions, because those were also really interesting. I thought you were hearing like the son who had killed this woman and this young woman in a boat crash. I mean, it was a terrible, terrible thing. He and there was a group of 6 friends. They were all like 19 or 18. And they were all deposed afterwards. And they all came from a real range of different sort of backgrounds, but they were good buddies. And you heard them talk. I mean, you heard them talk, and you felt what it was like to be on that boat. And I wanted to use it all, but you can't. So you gradually sort of whittle it down, but you make sure you hold on to the really good stuff, and the stuff that's. I mean, ideally, it's the stuff that's both kind of verbally interesting because it brings them to life as kind of characters on the page, and very revealing about what actually happened or didn't happen. And, you have to sacrifice a lot of stuff. I mean, it breaks my heart to think that I couldn't publish a 1,500-page book on this case, because I easily could have.
Wow. I know there are some of you who didn't get your questions answered, but James has graciously agreed to sign some books in the lobby, and we'll also have some lovely, the Hammer always supplies delicious cookies and good tea. So we can continue the conversation in the lobby. Thanks so much.
Thank you.